In this presentation, we will discuss how to learn tax law, in other words, an approach for learning tax law. When we consider tax law and tax preparation, it can be very overwhelming. There's a lot to learn, there's a lot to go over. It can seem like a daunting task, an impossible task to really learn how to do the tax preparation. Whenever this is the case, it's best to take a step back and think about what the approach will be in order to learn this information, the approach that we will apply in order to achieve our goals of learning the tax code, of learning the tax preparation. This is a very key step which is often overlooked when people approach the tax code. Our first strategy will be to learn tax preparation from 3 different perspectives, from 3 different angles. One being to learn the formula related to tax preparation, the others related to learning the forms, the actual 1040 and related forms, and the next is to learn the software, some type of tax software that we can then use. If we break this down into more detail then, our first perspective of tax preparation is with a formula. So rather than going right to the tax forms, right to the 1040, we want to think about what the underlying formula will be, because that's where we can break everything down into its essence. That's the way we can simplify things the most. You'll note, of course, when you put information into the 1040, you're going to have a lot of lines that you don't basically fill out. And you're not going to be reading everything on the 1040 typically as you fill out every kind of return. You basically have an idea of what the formula is over time, and then you can kind of apply that to what you expect to see within the 1040. So what you really want to have then is a vision in your mind of what the formula will be related to the tax preparation, and then be able to visualize how that basically looks within the 1040, how this formula then overlies onto the actual form of the 1040. The formula is on the right. We're going to go into it in more detail in future presentations. Just note for now, it's basically going to be an income statement. It's a funny kind of income statement. We have an income tax. We're going to have a funny kind of income statement in order to get the taxable income and then apply the tax to it. Again, it looks a bit complex right now. We'll go into it more detailed line by line as we go through in future presentations. When we consider the formula, we're going to work through that with Excel. So when we calculate things out with the formula, we're going to give you an Excel worksheet, which will in essence have the formula, and then we'll put that information into Excel so you can visualize it with a formula type of basis. The next way to learn it, of course, is with the actual tax forms. So the tax forms are going to look something like this. We have the 1040 on the right. Now the 1040 will of course be applying the same kind of tax formula that we had, but as we noted before, there's going to be a lot more information in it. There's going to be a lot more lines, and there's going to be supporting documentation related to the 1040. When we're thinking about the actual tax forms, what you want to do with the tax forms is, one, be able to apply the formula to it. And in order to do that, whenever you first see a tax form, you actually want to read through it. So you want to practice a few times putting some returns, some basic returns or calculations into the tax form, actually reading every kind of line item that you have. And when you get into the calculations on the 1040 will actually tell you, this is how I want you to calculate it. I want to take this line and do something to that line, multiply this line or add this line to that line. And it'll tell you how to calculate out the information. So you're not going to do that, of course, every time if you're making multiple returns, because you're going to be reliant on the formula in your mind and the software that you will be using. But it's really worth your while when you're starting, of course, to actually take the return by hand, get a PDF file or print out the return and enter that information directly into the return, reading each line item within the return. As you do so, you want to keep in mind the basic formula and think about how the formula would outline on the return. Again, this is a very tedious process. We won't do this with every example problem we have because it takes a long time. In practice, of course, practitioners have a kind of visualization of this form. They can basically see the formula related to it as they go in from the software to the forms. They have an idea of what's going to happen on the forms, and then they can have a system for basically verifying that information, possibly with something like an Excel worksheet with the formula to it, so that they can get an idea and verify the information that's going to be put into the 1040. The next way to learn this is with the software. So the software is going to be what we're going to use in order to do the data input. So pretty much everybody uses software these days, of course, even whether you do the return by yourself or whether you're at a tax preparation office or firm, a CPA firm or tax preparation firm, we're going to be using some type of software. More and more people are dependent on the software to some degree because of the complication of the tax code. So the software is a huge crutch for any tax preparer. Any tax preparer has some reliance to some degree on the software. Now, we do want to know what's going on, of course, and the real value in the tax preparer is for them to have a better understanding of the information so that they can make sure that the data input is correct, the form is filled out correct, they're reviewing it properly, and everything is good to go. But the software, any tax preparer these days is typically going to be relying to the software to some degree or another. Now, the software is confusing because there's a lot of them. There's a lot of different types of software that you can use. This is overwhelming in and of itself because if you're learning software, you're going to have to ask, well, why am I learning the software? What do I need this for? Is it for my individual taxes, or am I going to do tax preparation? And what type of software will I be using? There's multiple software for each of those objectives. So when we think about the software, you basically want to break that down into those two categories. You want to think, all right, the software, the data input software, you would think about as either professional. I would think of professional software as something that would be used by a CPA firm or tax preparation office. And then individual software is something that would be used by the individual. So if you break them down into those two categories, you can kind of group the way the software will look. And I'll give a little explanation of what the software will look like. We will be using Lacerte. So the tax preparation in all of our examples will be a professional software. It'll be Lacerte. Lacerte is owned by Intuit, the owners of QuickBooks. On an individual side, by contrast, we won't be using it, but a contrast software will be TurboTax, also owned by Intuit. This would be for individuals. Now, what's the major difference between these two types of software? Note that Lacerte, or the professional software, is going to be based on the idea that we're going to have multiple returns that are going to be prepared by a professional tax preparer that will then be providing that information to a client. So there's a lot more that we'll have to be dealing with that. One, the qualifications of the tax preparer, the detail of the firms that are making the tax returns. You got to make sure that they're qualified and they have all the preparer information. And so that's going to be an added thing that's going to be necessary in the professional tax software. And obviously the professional tax software having multiple clients within it is going to have to manage those multiple clients, manage the information within it, be able possibly to help out with sending things out like letters and whatnot to the multiple clients as the tax seasons roll over. So there's a lot more information that needs to be in the professional software for multiple returns that will actually help with the interrelationship of the clients as well. On the individual software, then you're making the returns only for one individual, and therefore you don't have all that information that you might need for the tax preparer information and the type of information to sort all the different clients and the type of information you would need in order to interact with the clients, like engagement letters or things like that, and invoices and whatnot. So that's one difference that you have. The other major difference is that the professional software will be basically a data input screen that you can jump right back to the forms pretty quickly. Whereas the individual software, something like TurboTax or H&R Block, will be in the form of an interview process. Now, you can learn a lot from both of these types of software. So I'm not saying one is better for learning than the other. The individual software is nice that because you're going to have that interview process, and that's basically, it's an electronic system trying to act kind of like a tax preparer would act dealing with a client, asking the relevant questions. So those interview questions that are going to be asked within a software like H&R Block or TurboTax will be similar to the questions that you would typically ask a client. That's the needed information and the kind of detailed information that would be needed that they're trying to get through like an interview type of process, a series of questions within the data input screen. When you think about the professional software, we basically have more of a direct data input right into the data input screen. It's not going to go through a series of interview kind of questions that you would need. And that's really useful for many tax professionals that do multiple returns and they want to do them quickly, because it's a lot easier to get back to the data input screen and jump back to the form rather than having to go through a set of questions to get there. So this is going to be a lot faster. So we can just basically go right to the data input screen, enter it in the data. I don't have a series of questions or a bunch of interview processes that we need, and then jump right back to the form and see that the change to the form for it. So over time, as you do more tax preparation, you're going to want that kind of flexibility because you have the basic idea of the tax return together. You want to be able to jump back and forth. When you're first learning the taxes, the interview process type of software will take more time, but it'll give you a good idea of what the basic kind of questions would be as you input that information. Again, another difference will, of course, be cost. The professional software will cost a lot more than the individual software for obvious reasons. We will be using the Lacerte tax software, so if you have a question about what we're using or the data input screens that we're going to be using Lacerte. It's owned by Intuit, the owners of QuickBooks.